Welcome everyone to the Observatorio of the Spanish Language and Hispanic Cultures in the United States. Welcome to this Instituto Cervantes at Harvard University. And welcome to this new conversation in the Observatorio with a special relevance for the Spanish literature. I'm sure that many of you know very well what the Instituto Cervantes is and what is this Observatorio. For that reason, let me say only a few words. The mission of this Instituto Cervantes is to promote the teaching, study, and use of Spanish as a second language, and to foster the Spanish and Latin American cultures, literatures included. The Instituto Cervantes and the Faculty of Arts and Humanities in Harvard University created in 2013 this Observatorio of the Spanish language and Hispanic cultures, whose mission is to offer a program of projects, events, and activities for the analysis, reflection, and discussion of the presence of the Spanish language in the United States. One of our identity signs is this kind of event, is a conversation in the Observatorio. So the scenario is as simple as powerful. A good theme to talk about, some experts, very well known, a nice space like this, and of course an enthusiastic attendee as you are. Our guest today is an excellent expert in Spanish literature, but he will be introduced by a very good friend of this Observatorio, Professor Daniel Aguirre. Daniel Aguirre is an assistant professor of Romance languages and literatures in Harvard University. He is an expert in modern Spanish peninsular literature and in Spanish Civil War, exile, historical memory, testimony. He knows very well also the modern peninsular and Latin American poetry. So we are very lucky for having Jonathan Mayhew and Daniel Aguirre among us today. And I hope you enjoy very much this conversation in the Observatorio. Thank you for coming to the Cervantes Institute at Harvard. And now please join me to welcome Daniel Aguirre.
Gracias, Paco. Thanks a lot. It is indeed a pleasure to have Professor Jonathan Mayhew with us today. Jonathan Mayhew received his PhD in comparative literature from Stanford, and he has taught, if I'm not mistaken, at the University of Kansas since 1996. He's the author of 4 books of modern and contemporary peninsular poetry: Claudio Rodriguez, The Language of Poetic Vision, The Poetics of Self-Consciousness, 20th Century Spanish Poetry, Apocryphal Lorca, Translation, Parody, Kitsch, and The Twilight of the Avant-Garde, Spanish Poetry, 1980-2000. Indeed, Professor Mayhew's contributions to the Spanish field of poetic production cannot be overstated. I'd like to highlight at least 5 areas where Professor Mayhew's work is, in my opinion, relevant. And I'll also give some examples of this contribution to very specific areas of study. First, cultural studies. I'll give one instance in my opinion, important but sadly discontinued journal La Alegría de los Naufragios. Professor Mayhew built on the dialectics of tradition and innovation in jazz to draw a very unique and illuminating comparison between Luis García Montero and Winston Marsalis. Another illustration, an article published, I believe, in the Journal of Spanish Cultural Studies, Poetry, Politics, and Power. Professor Mayhew critiqued the close relationship between culture and state institutions in Spain. The second area would be reception theory, along with the third one, translation studies, and a productive combination of both frameworks, most notably showcased probably in Apocryphal Lorca, which is also a good example of his work in the 4th area that I wanted to highlight, comparative literature and cultures. Another good instance of Professor Mayhew's comparative work is his exploration, also quite unique, of the connections between José Ángel Valente's poetry and Paul Celan's poetry. and all this from the perspective of a Heideggerian thought. This essay foregrounds Professor Mayhew's interest in what he calls high modernism, and in this sense, his essays on poetry by Claudio Rodriguez and Antonio Gamoneda are also notable. Last but not least, the fifth area I want to highlight is gender studies. And here I'd like to mention the last chapter of The Twilight of the Avant-Garde, Gender Under Erasure. I met Professor Jonathan Mayhew in St. Louis in 2010, I believe, 5 years ago. By then I was familiar with his work, and yet, after exchanging a few words with him, I was struck by his presentation, his demeanor, which seemed to me a unique combination of understatement and, what should I call it? It wasn't exactly passion, it wasn't investment. Maybe a culinary metaphor would help here. He showed what I would call a boundless intellectual appetite, what in Spanish we may call ganas de saber. I would go as far as to say that Professor Mayhew is an Epicurean intellectual. It should come then as no surprise that another important field in which Professor Mayhew excels is cooking. And I think it's important to underline this. In one of his last blog posts, because he also has a blog, he has some amazing culinary tips. For instance, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to quote you now, brining a pork loin in a brine of soy sauce, brown sugar, vinegar, fruit juice. Professor Mayhew also suggests some Free State Storm Chaser beer and Keith Jarrett's Standards in Norway played in the stereo. Here we have another example of your expertise in jazz. And Professor Mayhew concludes this post saying, "Life is good, my friends." Well, life is good today too, my friends, because Professor Mayhew is here. This talk, I think, has been a long time coming, so I invite you to please welcome him now to the Observatorio.
Thank you for that very, I'd like to thank Danielle for that very generous invitation and for the introduction and for the invitation to come here to Cambridge, to Harvard to speak. The problem, of course, when they invite you to Cambridge is that the audience is going to be more distinguished than the speaker, typically. So I'll just get right on with it, I suppose. I wrote, on my blog, I wrote a little prologue to the talk. I didn't realize it was a prologue to the talk when I wrote it, but this will lead into my main talk. Suppose a singer gives a moving performance of the song, "All the Things You Are." You are the promised kiss of springtime that makes the lonely winter seem long, etc. The singer could be male or female, but the singer did not write the words. The lyrics are by Oscar Hammerstein II. The music is by Jerome Kern. The implied recipient of the lyric could also be male or female, and this does not depend on the gender of the performer, or the gender of Oscar Hammerstein, or the gender of the original character in the musical comedy that sang, or the gender of the actor playing that role. To find the meaning or the emotional truth of the lyric or any performance of the lyric, we don't go back to look at the biography of Hammerstein. We could, but we don't do that normally. He wrote it for a failed Broadway show, and we don't especially care what he was thinking about when he wrote it. At least I don't. We could say it's a piece of conventional sentimentality, but is it? Its conventionality, after all, is what makes it work for any performer in any decade. Sometimes I feel that the melodies of these songs are superior to the lyrics, which can become dated or too specific to their time and place, like Fat Swallow's, gotta get my old tuxedo pressed, gotta sew a button on my vest, tonight I've got to look my best because Lulu's back in town. Maybe a little dated, but yet not really. The lyrics come alive again in a great performance, and even instrumentalists might be thinking of these lyrics when they interpret the melody or chord changes. All the Things You Are became a jazz standard and was beloved by beboppers. I suppose we could go back to that Broadway show and find out who the characters were and interpret the lyric in its dramatic context. No, not only was the show Very Warm for May, is the title, 1939, a failure, but the song has achieved independence from these origins. We could also find meaning or emotional truth in the performer's biography. This also might matter to us or not. We don't normally have access to the performer's inner life to know whether he or she is thinking about, what he or she is thinking about as a performance or recording takes place. We can invent a nice story about that, but we don't have to. It'll be significant to those who don't know or care. I don't know if I even have to finish this little prologue to my talk. The conclusion might be obvious. The meaning of the song is in its repeatability and its imminence. Its meaning in one imminent circumstance might be that it is sung at a wedding, and its meaning might be specific to that. But it will be sung at other weddings as well. Now, in my talk today, I'd like to give you a sketch of a book that I'm thinking of writing. The premise behind this book is strikingly simple. What would happen if we decided to read Lorca from the perspective of the phrase I've heard quoted many times, the postmodern death of the subject? This is a provocative proposal, since Lorca criticism has been unapologetically biographical. It might also strike you as anachronistic, though I'll argue that it is not. At the end of my talk today, after listening to my arguments, you can return to other ways of looking at Lorca if you want. I only ask you to entertain my modest proposal as a thought experiment with some potentially game-changing implications, not only for Lorca, but for larger considerations of poetic modernism and postmodernism and the relation between them. And I'll be getting back to the Oscar Hammerstein and try to relate that, but the relation is going to be in the Lorca's interest in the anonymous tradition, which some people have seen as sort of anti-modern facet of Lorca, but I don't see it in that way exactly. So the title of my lecture tonight, or this afternoon, Lorca's Modernist Self-Fashioning, with its obvious homage to Greenblatt's Renaissance self-fashioning, pose the question of how Lorca became Lorca. In other words, what enabled a young writer to make the jump from the right of juvenilia, which we have in abundance, to the mature artist. I situate this jump, just roughly speaking, in his first major work of poetry, Poema del Cante Hondo, which he completed in 1921. His literary self-fashioning entails an opposite of self-fashioning, a self-unfashioning, or a dismantling of the self. From my perspective, this dissolution of subjectivity runs parallel to that of other modernist writers, like Kafka, Pound, Borges, and Pessoa. My book will sketch out comparisons with numerous other writers as well, if I ever write this book. But my larger argument for today is that the death of the subject that we attribute to postmodernism has its origins in modernist poetics, and that Lorca is best understood this way, rather than as an example of subjective plenitude, whose biographical vicissitudes completely unproblematically account for his work. Could you hand me my water, Danielle? I meant to bring it, but I'm going to not get through that without water. Thank you. My approach is, I hope, also grounded in the best and most traditional Lorca studies. So my respect for the textual and biographical work of scholars and editors like Andrew Anderson and Christopher Murrer is undiminished. The question for me is how to understand Lorcaean poetics in light of both philology and poetic theory. I don't believe these approaches are incompatible, but certain hermeneutical assumptions often persist in Lorca studies where they're not found elsewhere. For example, I've had my students were talking about, in general terms, theoretical terms, well, do you look at biography? And they say, no, we don't. We know not to look at biography. But Lorca studies do. Few other authors are read with such biographical servility, hermeneutical naivete. The first step in my thought experiment then is to break Lorca free from the biographical imperative. Others have preceded me in this task to some extent. Much of what I will say here derives from the fundamental skepticism toward biography, or at least an oversimplified hermeneutics of biography, evident in Luis Fernandez Cifuentes' review of Ian Gibson. Cifuentes concludes this review by quoting Borges, quoting Leon Bloy, which quote I've always liked. No hay nada en la tierra, no hay en la tierra un ser humano capaz de decir quién es con certidumbre. And the Whitman quote comes here. When I read the book, The Biography Famous, when I read the book, sorry, it has to be a past tense. When I read the book, The Biography Famous, and is this then, said I, what the author calls a man's life? And so will someone, I am dead and gone, write my life. As if any man really knew aught of my life. Well, even I myself, I haven't think, know little or nothing of my real life. Only a few hints, a few diffused, faint clues and indirections I seek for my own use to trace out here. Now we know a lot about Lorca. There's lots of documentation. I mean, he lived to be 38 years old, but there's his life, his travels, his manuscripts. There's still work to be done on this. So we don't know everything, but we do know a lot. But this doesn't always give us a huge advantage hermeneutically. There's a gap between documentation and interpretation. Is this an irony, or does the amount we know get in the way? So if we'd just written a biography of Oscar Hammerstein, then we'll say, okay, this is who Oscar Hammerstein was thinking about when he said, you are the promised kiss of springtime. Borges advised us to distinguish between Walt Whitman, the semi-divine protagonist of Leaves of Grass, and Walter Whitman, el pobre literato que lo inventó. I propose that we introduce a similar distinction for Lorca, separating the Lorca myth from its somewhat self-conscious fashioner, who began as an adolescent imitator of Modernista poetry. Borges is a relevant figure here, since he is among the many modernist writers who began to question the centrality of the self, in essays like La nadería de la personalidad. Fernando Pessoa's creation of heteronymos is yet another angle of approach to the modernist dissolution of personality. Another might be Vallejo's dramatization of the dissolution of the autobiographical self in poems like Piedra Negra sobre Piedra Blanca and El Momento Más Grave de la Vida. Theories of dramatic poetry and poetic objectivity in Pound and Eliot might lead in yet another direction. I'm not claiming that all these modernists flee from strong and unitary notions of subjectivity in identical ways. In fact, what is surprising here is the multiplicity of approaches to a central problem. Citing a poem by Laura Riding, Carlos Piera observes that gran parte de lo que se ha escrito sobre la muerte del sujeto, del autor, es redundancia o simplificación junto a sus manifestaciones explícitas modernas. Instead of seeing postmodern theory, or what's more accurately termed poststructuralism, as a break from modernism, we might see it as a theoretical extension of modernist poetics. I reject then the views of one theoretical explainer. I found a textbook that gives you sort of a caricature view you give to your grad students. In the 1960s and 70s, a number of different thinkers started to question the validity of the human subject. Their ideas were ahead of their time, and the ahead, he puts his own word in square quotes. No, this is not true. We can't think of Foucault as ahead of his time in questioning authorial certainties. He was only catching up to modernism. Before going on too long, I have to contrast my understanding of modernist poetics with a simpler but only partially correct of modernism as a unitary movement with a certain heroic view of the literary genius as embodiment of a privileged subjectivity. This might be somewhat of a straw man view at this point. I don't know if anyone really believes this in its simplest form, yet it tends to lurk in the background, especially when what is at issue is the contrast between modernism and postmodernism. I am not denying the existence of a prophetic mode of larger-than-life subjectivity in modernist poetics, in Rilke and Juan Ramón Jiménez, for example, but to some extent this view results from a subsequent lionization and canonization of the great moderns that occurred after the heyday of historical modernism itself. What I'm trying to say is that this Orphic or prophetic mode, with its familiar grandiosity and ambition, is only one facet. Even when it occurs, it entails a certain separation of the poetic self into more than one self, because there's the pobre literato, who then creates this mythic figure of him or herself, usually himself, as prophetic genius. But what about Lorca? We have this Juvenilia, which is provided with a gold mine of material to understand Lorca better. Lyric poems, prose effusions, and dramas. We lack this for many other writers, even canonical writers. And in those cases, the mature oeuvre must speak essentially for itself. No one has claimed that Lorca's earliest writings are masterpieces, but they provide a fascinating glimpse into the development of the artist as a young man. The danger here is the idea that Lorca's more openly confessional writing shows us his true self, a self subsequently masked or simply made more cryptic in his later work, the work for which he actually is known. But what if the masking itself were a form of self-fashioning or unfashioning? In other words, what if Lorca became Lorca, the creator of the work for which you value him, precisely by leaving certain kinds of confession behind? In this sense, aesthetic considerations do enter into the picture to the extent that the adolescent persona can be annoyingly effusive or somewhat unreadable if you're not in search of his true self. Here we must keep in mind both the modernist flight from confession and the urge to reconfessionalize this poet, to demand that the poetry tell us the truth of the subject. Despite the obvious charms of Libro de Poemas, Lorca's first book of poems, which is basically what he wanted to save from his earliest work, there was a break between this book and his works of the early 20s, Poema del Cantejondo, Canciones, Suites. I'll be getting to Romancero Gitano shortly. One striking feature of the Poema del Cantejondo is the absence of the first person singular, which occurs only sporadically and never confessionally. In Canciones, there's a yo poético, but the speaker tends to be quasi-anonymous, as in some of the anonymous popular lyrics that Lorca was imitating. The suppression of the first-person confessional subject has one immediate effect: the disappearance of a certain adolescent persona. It doesn't totally disappear, but it's different, I would argue. Even in the children's poems like Mamá, yo quiero ser de plata, hijo, tendrás mucho frío. In a dialogue poem like this, neither speaker is the poet or a representative of the poet. So the poetic subjectivity implicit in Lorca's early poems is objectified, ascribed to a landscape, a musical instrument, an animal or plant, or else to another human speaker not identified with the speaker of the poem or with the authorial subject. I propose then a study of Lorca's personas del verbo. After cataloging his use of first, second, and third persons, I'll be talking mostly about first because I don't have time for everything. We can return to the question of the relation of the biographical subject in the Hablante Poética Lorquiano. And I was reading a book by a friend of mine, and he uses this phrase, el Hablante Poética Lorquiano. I said, no, there's no such thing. I mean, there's a speaker of each poem, but there's not something which you can generalize about. The study of interpolations, invectives, the intimate addresses, a second person, I can talk about if you invite me next year to Harvard again. So I'd like to make a kind of a catalog and try to be as rigorous as possible, but the categories can kind of overlap. I'll start with a confessional lyric subject identified with first-person pronouns, frequent in libro de poemas, and in the Juvenilia. When I use the word confessional, I'm using it on purpose. I'm thinking both of English language confessional poetry that emerged in the 1960s, Robert Lowell, John Berryman, Sylvia Plath. And I'm also referring to certain practice of reading poetry primarily as self-expression, even poetry that does not belong to the school. This confessional romantic reading is familiar to us from interpretations of Beckett. And I remember in a discussion of Quevedo once, on a class I was auditing by Mary Gaylord, and he says, students want to read Quevedo confessionally too. They want, that's his, said, but maybe it's not applicable to early modern period or to that earlier anonymous tradition where you don't have an author. A reading, the confessional reading does not require a first person singular, but it helps. There could be a mask like Berryman's Dream Song. He doesn't say John, he says Henry, but Henry is him. But we don't have to look very hard to see Lara behind Figaro or Berryman behind Henry. No? The first person, I mean, is what I call a quasi-anonymous yo. It's a first-person speaker, but without any biographical or confessional content. In other words, we don't jump to talk about what's happening here, unlike if we're reading life studies, say. Take this poem from Poema del Cantejondo. Oye, hijo mío, silencio. So, hijo mío, what's that? And so who's speaking there? Nobody in particular, right? Speaking voice could be male or female, and the address to hijo mío seems purely formulaic. The poem is not about the I, but rather the I is merely a conventional deictic place from which the enunciation arises. The hijo mío has no personal characteristics either. In the tradition of the popular anonymous lyric, the speaking subject is often female, even though the scholars tell us the authors are male. But we don't attribute the subjectivity of the speaker to any authorial subject at all. We simply don't care who wrote the poem. In most cases, at least. Lorca is a close student of this tradition, and I would suggest that the quasi-anonymous speaker allows him a kind of modernist objectification, a flight for the confessional self. Of course, nothing prevents us from doing a confessional reading, even of a non-confessional poetry, where we have to decide how to approach each text. Let's suggest that this is a choice. This is a choice that we can make as readers. I'll use a poem, Zarzamora con el tronco gris. Zarzamora con el tronco gris, dame un racimo para mí. And conclude, I'm not going to read the whole text as you have it in front of you. Zarzamora, ¿dónde vas a buscar amores que tú no me das? We can make a choice here to interpret biographically, perhaps the psychosexual expression of Lorca's subjective feelings, or we can make a choice to read it as a poem subject to the lyric conventions of quasi-anonymity. When I give this poem to my students, I say, well, why is this not an anonymous lyric? How can you tell it's not? And the answer we've come up with in class as a grad student, they say, well, maybe this was the answer I was leading them towards. It's almost too specific. It's not generic enough. There's things going on that are too interesting to look at, and it's not. La penumbra de mis espinas, there's this modernist or late night modernista penumbra here. There's a penumbra of meaning too, maybe. So it's not the same as just, tres moricas me enamoran en Jaén or something like that. Number 3, this is the easiest to explain, so I won't spend much time on the dramatized subject. There's a speaking subject, but it's clearly somebody with characteristics, like in La Casada Infiel. The speaker of the poem is a gypsy who's taken a woman down to the river, and we don't identify him with Lorca. The 4th thing I'd like to talk about is dialogue, and we see this also in Libro de Poemas quite a bit. So that's one of his discoveries in Libro de Poemas, is dialogue. More than one speaker, neither is identified clearly with authorial subjectivity, though one of them can be, depending on our assumptions. Mamá, yo quiero ser de plata. So do we want to read it biographically so we can talk about Lorca's feelings about maternity, infantilization, or can we take it as the quasi-anonymous song lyric? And dialogue is also, of course, a feature of the romance, and it's present in Romancero Gitano. And there's Dialog del Amargo, which is included in Poema del Cante Hondo. So I think, well, of course, he's the greatest dramatist after Calderon, so you'd expect dialogue to be an important feature of his lyric poetry. I'd like to discuss a little bit of the narrative voice that appears sporadically in Romancero Gitano, in which the narrator sort of drops that fourth wall and addresses the character directly. Antonio, ¿quién eres tú? Te llamara Camborio, no? Or in the other poem about Antonio de Camborio, the character addresses the author directly. Ay, Federico Garcia, llama la Guardia Civil. It's always struck me as like, okay, he's putting his name there, but not his authorial name. It has to be an octosyllable, of course, so it has to fit. So, ay, Federico Garcia. No? So, Edad Montoya, Romance de la Pena Negra, treats him somewhat rudely, saying, Pregunte por quien pregunte, dime a ti qué se te importa. Vengo a buscar lo que busco. Me alegría en mi persona. She's looking for her person, her subjectivity. She's lost it. I'll get back to that in a minute. The number 6, you writing this down and take notes for later for the exam after my talk. The number 6 is the prophetic subject. We've talked a little about this. The prophetic speaker in Poeta en Nueva York speaks in his own voice, but as a kind of larger-than-life, over-dramatized poetic voice. And it's not the same for me as the confessional subject, though. There's overlap and there's poems in Nueva York that are confessional, too, in Asesinado por el Cielo, things like that. The poet is Lorca himself, of course, as he said in his lectura conferencia or recital conferencia. But of course, he uses that third person in some of the headings. And el poeta, not yo in Nueva York, it's el poeta. The inflation of rhetoric, in my view, takes us out of the realm of the confessional subject. Indeed, critics have been hesitant to attribute Lorca's notorious denunciation of the maricas in his Ode to Walt Whitman to the biographical subject. But isn't this denunciation a function of the kind of poetic speaker that Lorca deployed in this book, rather than a simple and straightforward expression of the author's belief? The prophetic voice demands a certain stark moral absolutism, devoid of any nuance. It is based on an autobiographical core construct, but it goes beyond the confessional subject to create a semi-mythic figure of the poet. Number 7, I guess, would be the sort of a return of that straightforward confessional subject in the sonnets, many of the sonnets, in which you do pretty much identify, say, you could say, el poeta dice que, and some of the titles have that third person, el poeta, in their titles. No? Number 8, I think this is the last one, so then I'll be getting to sort of a development and conclusion after that. I guess I'll call this one the 0-degree poetic subject, where there's not any first person at all. There's no yo, nosotros, but yet we can still attribute the poem's emotional content to a fairly specific poetic subject. So we don't really need to have that pronoun or any pronoun associated with the first person to read confessionally. Following an astute observation by Carlos Piera, once again, in a brilliant essay with the title Yo, literalmente, we might think of unlinking the notion of yo poetica from that of the poetic subject, but of course keeping them in the same conversation. The yo is a deictic position, the grammatical place in which enunciation takes place. The poetic subject, on the other hand, is what the subjectivity we attribute to the figure of the poet, his or her inner life, whether or not there's a first-person singular pronoun to be found anywhere near the poem. This is not an exhaustive category or catalog of speaking positions, but it gives us some idea that Lorca is a dramatic poet as much as a lyric one. My survey might seem a bit literal-minded because I'm saying, okay, is there a yo or not? And we're all smart enough to not confuse narrators with authors and speakers with poets, except when we're not smart enough to do that. So the phrase las personas del verbo, of course, I'm taking from Jaime Gil de Viedma. So I'm suggesting that we take Gil de Viedma, who was influenced by some of Eliot's theories of dramatic poetry, and read Lorca in a similar way. Even when we read a poem by Gil de Viedma that we know to be confessional, we also know that Gil de Viedma created a literary character named Jaime Gil de Viedma in poems like Después de la muerte de Jaime Gil de Viedma contra Jaime Gil de Viedma, the two that come to mind. So now let's leave behind these grammatical categories and look at what kind of subjectivity is Lorca interested in exploring. Here too we have a variety of options which correspond inexactly to the various uses of the first person. Lorca is not particularly interested in really nuanced introspection or in overcomplicated forms of inner life. And if you teach like Unamuno's Abel Sanchez, say, where there's all this self-analysis and you go right to like yerma or something. It's not the same view of the human subject. Many of his best characters are defined by a single drive or passion. Yerma's overwhelming desire for a child, or by overwhelming forces of nature. Lorca is also very interested in the breaking of subjectivity, places where the subject breaks down. Vengo a buscar lo que busco, mi alegría y mi persona. Yo ya no soy yo, mi casa ya mi casa. This is a death of the subject and of subjectivity itself. It's not that there aren't complexities to these characters, but they aren't individualistic or well-rounded. They're defined by the moment in which they cease to be themselves. In the poem Suicidio, which I think is on the second or in the reverse of the first page, is a poem I've long been interested in. I'm not going to read it aloud because, in interest of time and leaving time for questions, but I'm sure you all know the poem well. It's not necessarily typical of Lorca because it is maybe a little more nuanced, a little more detailed. It's not at all similar to anonymous lyrics. It's very modern. It's typical, though, of certain kinds of exploration of the breaking it down of subjectivity, and of the facts. Typical in the sense that he doesn't only write one sort of poem in which this takes place. It's a portrait. I wrote here psychological, but I'm going to cross that word out. It's a portrait in the third person of a character in the process of self-forgetting, self-destruction, suicide. El jovencito se olvidaba. With a radical reduction of subjectivity. His heart is emptied out, replaced with alas rotas y flores de trapo. His use of language is reduced to a single word. His self is no different from exterior reality. Se sintió balcón y torre. Dehumanized and rigid, reduced to a geometrical figure. Remember the subtitle of the poem? ¿Acaso por no saberte la geometría? Something like that. I should have written that down too on your handout. He kills himself by smashing his own image in an alienated image. Or more accurately, this metaphor. This is the metaphor that the poem uses to depict his death. The description of the death is oddly dispassionate, distancing. The metaphors are complex and vanguardistic, far removed from the popular tradition. And the figure of the young suicide is somewhat particularized. Nevertheless, the poem depicts the death of the subject rather than exploration of rich subjectivity. And this is a third person poem logically because the person cannot speak for himself. So at this point I've discussed a variety of enunciatory positions defined by their personal pronouns, by the characteristics ascribed to the yo poetico. I've discussed hermeneutical possibilities for these enunciatory positions in relation to questions of confession and biography. I've suggested that neither the enunciatory positions nor the hermeneutic options are unitary, and that Lorca is interested in the dramatic possibilities of multiple points of enunciation and the expression of subjectivities that are reduced to unitary forces or to the outright dissolution of the self. Lorca's treatment of subjectivity, then, is complex and nuanced if we look at the entirety of his work, but that's not to say that he's interested in fine shadings of inner experience. If there is any subject position that's identifiably Lorcian, it is a subject divided against itself in a situation of extremity, on the verge of no longer being itself. In this sense, I believe that Lorca is closer to Kafka and to Beckett than to Rilke or Juan Ramón Jiménez, in which he parallels Kafka's empty subjects or Beckett's radical reductions of the self. I once made the joke that Yerma is expecting a son named Godot. Plays like El Paseo de Buster Keaton anticipate Beckett's absurdism. But the Beckett I'm thinking of here is that of the narrative prose as well, the unnameable, Malloy, etc. The inflated prophetic subject of Poet in New York might be the least convincing from a present vantage point. Not that this poetry is not powerful, but it seems inflated, making unsustainable claims to our identification with ideological positions that are not sustainable. It is here that the division between the literary creator and the literary myth reaches a kind of breaking point. So does the fact that Lorca's work dramatizes and thematizes the death of the subject mean that his work should be read theoretically from the perspective of the death of the subject? Not necessarily. I mean, that's a leap that we don't necessarily have to make. We can still explore the biographical events in Lorca's life that made him interested in this thematic break, the break of the subject. We read Kafka biographically, and there's many biographies of Beckett, despite the fact that these authors destroy certain notions of the subject. Yet I feel the biographical impulse in Lorca studies has led to the wrong sort of simplification, and the complexity of his work has been misapprehended. His work is complex in its exploration of multiple experiences, some of which might not be his own. And it occupies multiple positions for the enunciation and dissolution of subjectivity. One traditional view of Lorca is that once we find the central cause of all his work, then we can attribute each of his works back to this cause. Even if you decide to reject my reading of Lorca in terms of the postmodern trope, the death of the subject, I think you should find it impossible to return to the position that Lorca is interesting because he expresses the same unitary thematic material in each and every one of his immensely varied works. All his avant-garde plays, his rural dramas, his imitations of and adaptations of anonymous poetry, poetic experiments, his lectures, his letters. Of course, his letters, I mean, we can talk about the persona he creates in his letters, which is clearly designed for that particular interlocutor, if he's writing his parents, or Guillen. It's, he was conscious of who he's writing to that second person. It's something I have to work out too. This variety of enunciatory positions, for me, allows for a greater development of sub-expositions as well, many of which are not simply masks for Lorca's own subjectivity. I'm perhaps I'm the minority of readers, maybe. So I always have to caution myself that people will not agree with me. But I was reading El País and archives about Lorca. There was a story about the real novia, Boda de Sangre, just died. And I said, no, that's idiotic. In the real story, it's someone killed with a shotgun, and then the whole central image of the Sangre is the knife. So you can't just say, well, no. I'm always disappointed to read, El Público. Well, Lorca was disappointed in a love affair, so he wrote El Público. It seems reductionistic. Because of Lorca's charismatic personality, and because we know so much about him, a certain biographical hermeneutics rushes into every opportunity to explain his work. Perhaps it is too late to take another approach, but in my view, biography tends to lead to less interesting and more naive readings. I will conclude then that Lorca's self-fashioning, he became Lorca by exploring alternate selves, alternate visions of the selves and of non-selves, rather than simply remaining himself. And in so doing, he became a major modernist poet. Thanks for your kind attention. trying to finish by 6:30 to leave some time for the dialogue part of this event.
I'm sure that some questions that you're
Donald?
Well, I have lots of thoughts, and I'm not that familiar as I should be with Lorca's poetry itself. But it seems to me that you might be right about all this biographical stuff, but nonetheless, what happens to the poetry other than sweeping it up within the vacuum of the death of the subject, which is a 120-year long experience, as it were? You used the word imminent once, and I'm wondering if you could help us read something that was imminent within some poem that would reward a more focused reading than just the depth of the subject. Or is it always the depth of the subject?
No, it's not always the death of the subject, but I mean, not all his poetry is concerned just with that. What I was trying to say is that I kind of took a very narrow approach, and I'm only looking at enunciation. So that's not the only way to look, but I'm saying what happens if you take that same view and look at everything, try to compare it based on that. But I mean, imminent would be sort of what I meant by that was, we're listening to the song right now. What are we feeling right now? We're not worried about where it comes from. We're not. And that's that link to that anonymous. But I mean, people have seen, okay, the canciones or something is just like neo-popular thing, and that's not the modern Lorca is in Poeta in Nueva York. But I've never agreed with that. I say never, I mean in the past 10 years I haven't agreed with that perspective. I might have thought that earlier in my life. But Chris?
Yeah, I was very interested in your talk, and I think it's given us new readings like suicidio. And I was very interested in the idea, in your distinction between biography and non-biographical reading. First of all, I find the fragmentation of the self a fascinating topic, and so thank you for bringing it up. One thing you seem to ignore is that biography is a critical tool that allows us to have a text in the first place. In other words, in the case of someone like Lorca, whose work was, as you know, dispersed, fragmented, lost, recovered, badly edited, mutilated, censored, the textual body there in pieces. So only, for example, biography combined with textual criticism allows you to have sweet poet in New York. So biography, no one in this room is stupid enough to ask who's the real Soledad Montoya or Antoñito Camborio.
Well,
let's
those people out of the room that might.
In chucking out, no, I mean, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think it's a part of textual criticism.
Right.
I think to state the obvious. Sorry.
I think you're right on target there, and that's why. I mean, when I wrote my first book on Lorca, I had been intimidated for years about working on Lorca because, I mean, there's these people like Andrew and Chris here that, have worked with the manuscripts and reconstructed things and brought us the text that we have today. And Suites was, El Público was not published till, that was in 1979 or some, So, I mean, we didn't even have this text to interpret without this biographical / textual, without that documentation. So, that's and I'm glad that it doesn't have to be me to do that textual work, because I'm not patient enough or gifted enough in that, or knowledgeable enough to do that sort of work. So I try to be careful, and but I made mistakes too when I was writing this first book on Lorca, because I was lacking some of that textual tradition, I think. So some were corrected by outside reviewers of the book, so that was helpful. But yeah, I made some really dumb things that, like, okay, well, why did I think that? But you're right, yeah. You have to be modest about those things.
I have one more thing about the fragmentation of.
Oh yeah.
That is the interesting. Sorry, I'm like. Subject is really.
Christopher, we're recording, I think.
Yeah, I believe that after, even before Lorca's death, let's say to return to the biographical vein, so many absurd Lorcas were out there. Lorca the kulak, Lorca the campesino, Lorca the gypsy poet, there were so many false or true, whatever. There were so many personae floating around there like hot air balloons that a huge sort of corrective effort was required to dispel. I mean, I was reading the other day that Lorca was a cattleman. That Lorca, this stuff starts in 1937. So
And it's never stopped either. It's never stopped, and the corrections kind of are powerless to stop that sort of proliferation of and that's sort of the starting point of my first book on Lorca. Was like all these ideas people had looking at the first book reviews and of Lorca in the U.S. This Lorca, this Spanish Andalusian barbarian, with his guitar, the cave with a gypsy. I mean, it was, really the herencia of this, the Spanish romantic, European views of romantic Spain, and then Lorca's image just sort of exploded into that void of. But yeah, that's a good point. Maybe I can use that to link my two books. I haven't thought of that before. That's good. Thanks.
Jonathan, you know I am with you. I don't generally read biographically or anything like that, and yet I would like to build on Christopher's question or Christopher's comment, because you have made a great effort to show and separate the phenomenon of the biography. In fact, you have used several terms: biography, autobiography, confession, and so on, from the actual poetry, and to show that there is a disconnection there. However, your very effort to do that, and the fact that, and yet, there are biographies, and there is an incredible appetite on the part of the reader to read biographies of poets, writers of every kind. You have mentioned several of them. There are other biographies going back to Hilde Wiedmann and so on. How do you account for that then? Is that a mistake? Is that
No.
a approach on the part of the reader? Are they totally unnecessary?
No, I think it's
other than what Christopher was saying. So why are they there, and why are they such a big business?
Well, it's not. It's with anything. I mean, people read biographies of all sorts of people. I mean, it's a natural. It's fascinating in its own respect. I mean, I read Ian Gibson too. I've read that. I mean, I've read everything biographical because it's fascinating. I mean, why he was such a magnetic personality. His life's interesting. The people he knew, his life and times are interesting. So it doesn't require a separate explanation. It's just a question. It's a hermeneutic question. But no, of course, why wouldn't you be? I mean, I would read a biography of Oscar Hammerstein too. I read a biography of Billy Strayhorn, great Duke Ellington collaborator. Read 2 biographies of him, actually, and I didn't necessarily do it to understand his music better. I just was interested because he was this openly gay black man in 1940s and in New York, and friends of Lena Horne, and he couldn't be his own band leader because Ellington sort of kept him. So it's fascinating. Why wouldn't you be interested in that? So it's not like, and the final point I'd like to answer both of you is, Lorca is still an author. I mean, you still approach him through that proper name, Lorca. So you still look at all the different author functions an author can have. So it's not like Barthes' Death of the Author. It's more like Foucault's The Author Function, if you want to distinguish between those two theoretical approximations. So part of the author function is, what Foucault does, making a list 1 through however many kinds of authors there are. You do that as well, yes. So I can't dissolve the subject of Lorca studies, which is Lorca himself. I can't say, well, no, you should just read it all as though it were an anonymous text. I'm not proposing that. So that's the final. I think that might answer both. And this is what I mean by an audience more distinguished than the speaker having Luis and Chris in your audience.
You're doing great. Don't worry.
Yeah.
We're all
So,
very happy.
and
We have another
maybe-
distinguished.
Well, I'm very happy to be here, but I gotta tell you, you haven't just given me homework, but you've probably given me years of work.
that's
So, I'm not
that's
much
the
of a,
idea, yeah.
I'm not much of a poetry guy, but while your work here was more concentrated on the biographical aspect of it, but you elaborated more on the poetical side. I wonder what is really so fascinating on that and your research on the poetical side that made you elaborate such. Your concentration was more on the poetic side.
Well, I don't know if I can explain why Lorca is not ever letting me go with this fascination with the poetry itself. But I mean, it's precisely because I've always felt that, the poetry can be lost to some extent because the explanation for the poetry overwhelms it. But I mean, I can't explain why, I got into this Lorca business in the first place. I mean, I can say that I always loved Lorca and taught him, but I waited till I thought I had enough scholarly maturity to do that. I don't think I could have done my first project on Lorca. I could have, but it wouldn't have been, any good. So, I think it takes a while to muster up one's courage for something like that. So, I mean, I can't explain why. I mean, it's a combination of factors, and not just with me, but with the entire world. So I can't really explain that right now. But it's definitely he's definitely a force to be reckoned with. Yes.
Maybe somebody would write your biography someday to try and find out exactly.
Sería aburrido, no? My biography with me or the book at home reading Lorca.
Well, in introducing Jonathan, I didn't mention that he's also obviously a translator, but also a poet. So, I mean, we have his poetry and maybe his biography. So, another
But
interesting
yeah,
thing.
that's what I was thinking, like, the stuff I wrote when I was 15, I wouldn't want people to interpret my personality mainly through that. It would be scary.
But you use your own last name in the title of your book, right? Mayhew's Mood or Moods?
Well, yeah, that's another story.
Oh, that's well, we won't get into that.
I would like to express what I think about reading poetry, and perhaps you can give me your opinion on my opinion, whether I think I'm right or wrong or something in between. I think
we should approach poetry, Lorca's poetry or any poetry, by facing the text first. And that allows us to, the text will lend itself to so many possible interpretations or feelings, actually. If you don't feel poetry, I don't think there's much to it. Whether it's a negative feeling or a positive feeling. But then once we do that, and we go to the poet himself or herself, you know, and read about his or her life, then we can analyze the poem a little better, in the sense that the multiple interpretations will be reduced to fewer interpretations, because now we know something about the poet's life. And I don't know.
Why would you want fewer, though?
No, I'm not saying that I want fewer, but I'm saying that that's what would happen.
Right, I agree. I'm not going to say you're wrong, because if that's the way you approach it, I can't tell someone else they're wrong. I'm not going to give you instructions on how to read a poem here. What I'm saying is, as you say, biography can reduce the number of interpretations, and my approach, I think, can possibly work in the opposite direction.
That's interesting.
Because it can break, you assume you know what something means, and then you decide, well, no, what if it doesn't mean that? So it's just, I mean, you have to know, I mean, the context for this is the sort of the, something Luis has written about several times in many book reviews, which is sort of the worst Lorca criticism is like worse than anything on any other canonical author. ¿No lo has dicho tú? ¿Lo has escrito? So it's kind of the context is a little bit of that. Sort of, that's another question. Why? In what ways is it bad, if it's bad? And why? Why is it bad? And it's not only bad because it's biographical, or because it takes one of those, Lorca vaquero is the truth, or Lorca el gitano. It's not only bad because of that, but that's one of the ways people go astray is in sort of, and you used reduce, which the adjective that comes to mind is reductive. So you say, okay, now I understand. Beckett wrote this because of this reason, and you know, it can be fascinating. I mean, it can be interesting. There can be interesting readings or unsuspected readings. For example, a reading of Beckett's Watt, which interprets it as Beckett's experience in the Résistance in France. It's a wonderful biographical reading which enriches the text, and I don't exclude that by Marjorie Perloff in her book Wittgenstein's Ladder. So that's one way you can go, of course, you know. But I wouldn't want that to say, okay, now we know what Watt's about. Marjorie proved that, and we don't have to read Watt anymore. Why would you want to do that? Why would you want to have sort of that? I mean, it can be brilliant or not, but it's just one avenue that you might want to take. Otra preguntita.
Do you want to follow up on
Si quieres.
Perhaps just one more second. I was thinking that in nowadays, where a computer could compose a wonderful poem, after we find out, I think this is how I would feel, after finding out that it was a computer and not just randomly and not a human being, that poem is not the same anymore, you know. I personally would like to think of a human being behind that poem. I'm just picturing Pablo Neruda in Colombo, you know, suffering, you know, and that shows in his Residencia en la Tierra, you know, and taking that out, I don't know.
Well, what you're to turn that around, what you're saying is, as a reader, we need to posit something there, and I agree completely. We need to posit that there's some sort of subjective experience there. Otherwise, we're not, doing anything maybe. So yes, I agree.
Jonathan, thank you so much. It's wonderful to hear you.
Oh, great to see you.
It's great to see you. It's been too long. I think I have questions that are sort of at the two extremes of your catalog of subject positions. And by the way, I think it's a wonderfully productive way to go about thinking and reimagining Lorca, so I can't wait to see what you do. One is, it seemed to be the dominant note, which is the notion that of Lorca's fascination with breakdowns, breaks, ruptures, breakdowns of the subject, and his. You said, I believe. Glasses back so I can read my scribbled notes. That Lorca's subjects become who or what they are when they cease to be themselves, and that was perhaps apropos of your reading of Suicidio.
Well, we don't know who that is.
Right.
We don't have the previous biography of the young man.
Right. So, which I think suggests that we're not only talking about a loss, namely a rupture, breakdown, but a gain. And so I am curious to hear from you more your thinking about what is gained in this breakdown, in this, crashing against a wall. I'm particularly fascinated with the broken mirror image. That's one that Cervantes uses in the very first page of La Galatea as an image for the subject. And I wonder if I just haven't found an earlier instance of that usage. So the other part of my question would have to, I was going to ask a question about confessional mode in Lorca, and that didn't come out so strongly, I think, in your talk. But I also would like to hear you talk a little more about Lorca's exploitation or surrender to popular poetic modes, his embrace of a language that isn't only his, that has a collective origin and resonance of multiple subjects.
To start with that, I think maybe he saw kind of that objectivity and anonymity to some extent. I mean, it wasn't just Lorca, of course. It was like something that poets been doing for a while, going back to the 19th century, and just thinking that there's value in that lírica de tipo popular, I don't know the proper terminology of what's that Margaret Frank's book called?
Sure, the lírica de tipo popular.
Lírica de tipo, that's, I think he loved that stuff. I mean, I think he cites it in his lectures. I mean, I think he just saw that as, a way of getting to that, an escape from the self in some way, but also very modern kind of writing. When the romance as well, I mean, he saw that, the possibility. I mean, the romancero viejo, of course, has like constant dialogues, and people talking to us, and so he saw the possibility of, dialogue, because it's a dramatic form as well as a narrative form, People say, well, he tried to do the narrative and combine the narrative and the lyric, but that third element there is the dramatic, right? Now, what was your other question?
Can I follow up on that just
Yeah.
for a second? But for me, objectivity is a curious choice of a term.
Right, I agree, yeah.
I mean, I think you can get trapped in the binary subjectivity, objectivity.
Right, but I'm thinking of it as sort of a negation of a too subjective a position, sort of a, not in absolute terms objective, but more like, enmascaramiento de lo subjetivo.
But it would be not lacking in subjectivity. It would be just a different subject, a floating subject,
Right,
wouldn't it?
but-
I mean, these are very personal voices.
But I mean, yeah, but I'm saying, I mean, part of the idea I was trying to get at was, I hate these terms because they're so almost polluted by our distrust of them, but like the term universality in the sense of, if the poetic speaker is not Lorca, then it could be anybody, or anyone can sing that song and it can be their song. That's what I was trying to get at with the,
So what's your best, your favorite example of a confessional Lorcan poem? Or don't you have one yet?
I think maybe the first poem in Poeta en Nueva York, asesinado por el cielo, entre las formas que van hacia el cristal, las formas que van hacia la sierpe. Lo estoy citando mal, but I think that's probably the one that I think, is probably, you probably should read that, confession. And confession is one mode that he uses. And it's hard to not read confessional poems biographically. So yeah, I mean, I want to include this confessional mode as one of them, and not simply say, like, when I first started saying, yeah, no, it doesn't like to throw out all that. But no, I've decided to be a more mature decision on my part to keep that, but just to say, well, yeah, that's part of what he's doing, but not all the time and in every poem.
Paco confessed to me a few minutes ago that we have a spread catering out there waiting for us, so we can continue the conversation while enjoying.
Y puedo contestar más.